Okay, in this video we're going to look at incorporating sound into your application. That could be background music, that could be the sound of a weapon firing, it could be the sound of something approaching and then you'd want the sound to get louder, and then as the object passes you, you'd want it to get quieter, like say an emergency vehicle driving past you and it has some kind of siren. You want that siren to change in volume based on proximity. So we're going to look at those types of things. So first is background music. It is the easiest thing to do. First, to get music, or any other asset for that matter, into your application, you just drag and drop it from the folder. So you simply open a folder, drag and drop the asset, and it will appear. So that's all it takes to get sound into your application. So now that it's in your asset area, you just drag and drop it into the scene. So we're going to take this, and you don't have to do anything with it. By default, it's what's known as a 2D sound, and that is, it really doesn't take proximity into consideration. When I talk about proximity, I talk about what's known as the audio listener. By default, it's on your camera. So think of the camera as the player's ears within the game, and that is, depending on proximity to the audio listener, depends on a volume if it's a 3D sound. And in case we said the background music is going to be 2D sound, and so it doesn't matter the proximity of the audio listener. So let's go ahead and play that. So you should be able to hear that music playing in the background. It's in the Hall of the Mountain King. Now let's take a look at some attributes of that. So if we click on the Mountain King object, here you have audio source. And it gives you a lot of settings, most of which we're not going to deal with. But one I want to point out is the spatial blend 2D. This is what determines whether or not this object fades depending on proximity. And in this case, as we said, it's proximity to the camera because the camera has the audio listener. So since it's 2D, doesn't matter where the camera moves, the sound is not going to change. So that's pretty easy. I do want to point out two things though. Play on awake. You want it to play when the game starts, or when the scene loads to be more precise. And the question is, do you want it to loop? More than likely, yes. So by default, loop is not checked, so make sure you check that so it keeps playing. This particular loop is something like 3 minutes long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing just to confirm that it loops. So those are the things I want to point out, whether or not you want it to play in awake, whether or not you want it to loop, and whether or not it's 2D. So let's look at an example of 3D sound. So we will take an object. In this case, it's a UFO. And what we're going to do is we're going to take we have a siren sound. We're going to drag and drop that onto the object. So whereas this sound, well, technically it's not its own object because there is a transform attached to it, but there's nothing else. There's no a sprite, there's no text. It's pretty much just an audio source with a location. Well, in the case of the UFO, it's embedded into a larger object. So like I said, technically this is an object, but it's not anything you see, it's not anything that you move. Whereas with a UFO, it does have an image and can have it can have movement and that sort of thing once we add a few other components. So again, play and awake, loop. But this is, we're going to make some additional changes. Spatial blend, bring that all the way to 3D. Doppler level, bring that down to 0. And then what you have to do is you have to decide what kind of distance makes sense for your application. So I'm going to change this to linear roll off And you're going to notice something, that the sound really doesn't change that much until after it gets below 0.5. I'm uncertain why, but in this case, as long as you understand that that's how it works, then you can adjust for it. So max distance, how much distance do you want to even be able to hear this object? So let's put it to 60. And if I zoom way out, you'll see there's actually this large area showing where you can hear this, which means you can actually technically hear it while you're 3 cameras width away, because here's the camera. You can see that you would still hear it way out there. So you have to decide what makes sense for you. Now, what we need to do, we're going to shrink this for a moment or collapse it. We're going to add physics 2D. We're going to add rigid body 2D just so we can move it around. Gravity scale 0 so it doesn't fall. And we're going to go ahead and I already have a script here that I had written. I'll just open it up so you can take a look at it. So it's really simple. So first of all, to create a script, you just right click, choose create, and choose C# script. So that's easy enough to do. Nothing as far as variables declared, nothing in the start, and in the update we have get component rigid body 2D. So what this does is whatever object this script is attached to, you're modifying the rigid body. What are you modifying? The velocity. And what are you doing? You're making it move -5 in the x-axis because you're doing a vector 2. So this is x, this is y. -5 moves you from the right to the left. So let's click on the UFO. Let's drag and drop move audio to it. And now, let's go back to the audio source. So we changed spatial blend to 3D. We got rid of the Doppler level. And we set the max distance to 60, and we're using a linear roll-off. And any one of these you can tweak if you want certain things to happen, like maybe you want some, I can't really go into too much detail with Doppler level, but let's just say it distorts the sound for want of a better term. It kind of gives it like a warble. So maybe you want that to happen because maybe you're going through caverns and you want some kind of specific effect. But for us, we just want a linear drop-off. So let's go ahead and play this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to scene so you can see where the object is. See, it really didn't get quieter to the very end there. In fact, not just 0.5, it really didn't get quieter until it was around 0.2. So, just like using particles, there's going to be a lot of sculpting to this where you're going to tweak a lot of settings. So, right-click, choose Add Key. And what we're going to do is going to drop that lower to begin with. And now let's play it again. Still not quite right though. So let's move this in. That's more like it, because then it really started to fade. So some of this is going to be trial and error. And we'll run it just one more time. So you really notice the fade now as it's getting off the screen. In fact, the 60 might even be too far. So in this case, you're really going to deal a lot with what the max distance is, as well as how much the volume drop-off is to get exactly the effect that you want. So that's good enough for now. Well, maybe we'll tweak it just a little bit more. We'll tweak that down to 40. But as you can see, the bulk of the sound change is way down here. It's below, not just below 0.5, but even below 0.2 that you really hear it getting quieter. So that should about do it for that. So we have background music, we have sound based on proximity, and we're going to now do sound based on instantiation. So let's take our player, put them into the game, and they're just going to fire like a magic shot. So let's go ahead and create that projectile. So drag the bullet object into the scene. Going to add a couple components, physics 2D, rigid body, and set gravity scale to 0. So this allows us to give it velocity, and we're setting gravity scale to 0. That way it doesn't the bullet doesn't descend towards the ground. You may want that, but in this case it's just like an energy bullet, so we want it to keep the same height. Add component, physics 2D, circle collider. Let's just move this so we can see it. Just like the UFO, the sound is going to be part of the energy bullet. So let's take boss shot, drag and drop it onto the bullet, and now it has a sound effect. Play and awake, we want it to play when it gets instantiated, but we don't want it to loop. The only time you'd have a loop if it's like a thruster, like say you've got like a missile and there's a thruster on it, maybe you'd want to keep that. Or maybe if it's say like a landmine and it's beeping for like 5 or 10 seconds. But again, you could also take care of that just by having it be of have the sound effect be of a certain length to begin with. Okay, so we take the bullet, we drag and drop it into the asset area, and that turns it into a prefab. Let's delete it from the scene. Good. Make two other changes. Click on the UFO. We're going to shut off the sound just so we can more clearly hear the bullet to make sure it's working. So you can have more, but that siren pretty much drowns out everything. Now for the bodyguard, we want the bullet to instantiate from the wand. So we're going to make a little change here. If you click on the image itself in the asset area, and you see that the pivot is the center, click on Sprite Editor. We can change that pivot. So we can change it to custom, and then we move this little selector to here. Watch what happens. She moved. The reason why is because the pivot is where Unity is placing this character based on. So when you click on the character, that's the center point. That's what Unity was using. We said, alright, we want the pivot to be the tip of the wand, and so they got moved. So keep in mind, if you do that, that there are ramifications of moving what the pivot point is. But now, it's going to instantiate right there. So let's go ahead and create a script. Right click, create C#. We'll call this body G control, since she's the bodyguard. Click on the bodyguard, drag and drop the script, and now what we want to do is we want the bodyguard to be aware of the bullet prefab. So first thing we have to do is go ahead and open that script. So we're going to do public transform, and it's going to be, call it bullet obj short for object, and we need to be able to detect a keystroke. So public key code fire bullet, and we'll go ahead and save that. Let's go back to the character that the script is attached to. You can see we now have these two variables. So drag and drop the bullet prefab onto bullet object, and for fire bullet we're just going to use the space bar. Now we just need to instantiate the bullet. So instantiate bullet object, where do we want it to be instantiated? We want it to be instantiated at transform.position. That's the pivot point that we chose. And we want it to have bullet objects rotation. So, bullet object is what gets instantiated. Where does it get instantiated? It gets instantiated at the position that this script is attached to. That's what transform.position means. And since this script is attached to the bodyguard and the pivot point for the bodyguard is the tip of the wand, that's where it should now instantiate. And we're using the bullet object's rotation. Now we don't want that to happen at the update. We want to have something happen first to trigger that. So if input dot get key down, that way it only fires once. If you use get key, it will be a rapid fire. Get key down is the single frame in which the button is pressed. Get key down, and it's fire bullet. Oh, did it again. Shows fire script. Fire bullet. There we go. Our brackets, just in case more things get added. And that should do it. Let's save that. And now when we hit the spacebar, she should fire. Excellent. The only thing it didn't do is it didn't move because we didn't add a script to the bullet itself. So let's go ahead and add a script to the bullet. So we'll click on bullet. Alright, so we'll right click, we'll choose create, we'll choose C#, and we'll call this, I'm not sure if I use bullet control anywhere else in this project, so we'll call this bullet shot. We'll go ahead and we'll click on the prefab, drag and drop that onto it, and we'll just open that up, and on start it will have get component, rigid body 2D velocity new vector 2 5,0. So at the start of this object's creation, and that is in this case when it gets instantiated, we're giving it a horizontal velocity of 5. So now it should move. There we go. Now let's combine it. So let's go to the UFO, plan awake. So it faded into the distance. Should be able to hear the music in the background. I can hear it here, but the final video might be a little quieter. Okay, a brief splice there while I added a new sound file. We're going to do one more example where this time a sound is going to play not based on instantiation, but based on whether you're doing some other kind of function. So where there isn't instantiation and yet you want the sound to play. So the first thing that comes to mind is jumping. So here's how we do that. We're going to add to the bodyguard physics 2D rigid body so we can have them be able to have velocity. Okay. Now we're going to set gravity scale to 0. So when they jump, they're just going to keep going up in the air, but that's okay. This way they don't fall off the screen. Now the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a new key code to the script for the bodyguard. So public key code and we'll call this jump press. Save that before we continue. So we're on the bodyguard. So jump press should appear. Let's make this W. Jumping is often the space key, but this is just for demonstrative purposes, so we'll make it W. Now, if input dot get key down, and again we don't want get key, that would be rapid fire. We want get key down, and it's jump press brackets. Then we want get component audio source play. So this is saying, pretty straightforward, play the audio source. So what we're going to do is, to continue, we need to add an audio source to that object. So on the bodyguard object, let's take the jumping sound effect, put it on to the player, and what we're going to do is, we don't want this to play in awake. For everything else we've done play in awake, we don't want this to play in awake, because we want to be able to only have this play on demand, and as we said, we want it to play when you press jump. So let's go ahead and do that. So you can hear the sound of them jumping. They're not actually jumping though. So let's go ahead and put in the command to make them jump. So get component rigid body 2D velocity equals new vector 2, and this is on the y coordinate, so we'll put in 3. And again, we'll shut off the UFO sound so you can better hear the jump. There we go. So that should about do it. To have the jump work right, you really want to have, as far as the visuals of the jump working right, you'd want to have the gravity scale on 1, so it brings them back to the ground, and you'd want ground to be beneath them. This was purely demonstrating the fact that you can initiate a sound play based on a keystroke. So even though nothing was instantiating, you're playing it on the keystroke. So that should about do it. If there's any other examples you'd like to see, just let me know.